Is there anyone out there who, in the last several weeks, months, years, have been a little bit like, what is going on in the world? I think we all have that feeling of what just happened. Because I know about 10 years ago, for me, I was thinking, well, you know, life is pretty good. Like, there are things that the planet will address that we need to take care of. Hunger in places and differences in economic status that create hardship for people, but things that are workable. And I thought we had evolved, silly me, into a place where these horrible wars, man's inhumanity to man, that we had evolved beyond that, that was all stuff in the past, and that those dark ages were something that we humans had gone, wow, we don't want to do that anymore. We are turned the corner. And just when it seemed like we had done that, a whole bunch of things happened that created a sense of instability. It started as a sense for me. And frankly, for me, the start of that sense was many years ago when at the Vancouver airport, the RCMP tasered a man who couldn't speak English. Remember that? For me, that was the beginning of a mistrust. Like, it shook my sense of the police have got your back no matter what. And then I think, how privileged am I that it took me until that long to have that feeling, because there are some people who live with that from the time they were born. So that was, for me, the first time that I was like shaking my sense of my foundation is a solid rock. And for you, it may be something else. It may be something that happened before that, or it may be something that happened after that. But if you think back, you'll realize that there was a time where a different light went on. And you started to realize that things didn't feel quite as solid as they used to. And over the planet, we've seen that grow, that feeling. It's almost as if it's in the energy field of the planet. That anger, the polarization, the if you're not with me, you're against me, the either or thinking. And that has led to this sense of, what the heck just happened? And then there's a sense of despair about it, because it feels as if we can't do anything. It's out of our control. And we all long for that feeling of security again. And I say all, even though I'm projecting that longing onto you, I'm going to trust that that is true. And so I want to share some ideas with you about where I think we are, in the hopes that it actually adds more clarity for me and perhaps for each of you as well. And I started thinking about this talk in the summer, long before the events of October 7th, which just shifted everything again. It just rocked our world one more time. And then the aftermath and the continued fallout of that horrible experience is continuing to create havoc for people. Discussions of for and against. And I had originally thought of doing this on Remembrance Day, this talk, and these ideas that I've been having. And then I thought, no, Remembrance Day is about remembering the people who have suffered to get us here. And I think we could use today as a way of resetting and upholding the values that we say that they went to war for us for. And so here are a couple of concepts that I thought of. One is that history repeats. People have been at war and at peace and at war and at peace for as long as people have been around. If you look back at any of the Hebrew scriptures, you'll see that there is this cycle of order and chaos and order and chaos. And I'm sure that if we were to go back even further into more ancient times, that we would see that in various cultures, that there is a time for war and a time for peace, just as was said in Ecclesiastes. That there is this cycle that happens. And I think that this is, in some ways, a really powerful thing to notice. Because once we recognize that history repeats, we can say whether or not it's something we want to repeat. And if it's something we don't want to repeat, we have the opportunity to break the pattern and to shift with a different response. And I think of the teachings of Jesus in this. Because the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew law, set out the rule of an eye for an eye. And the reason that law was put into place was to ensure that a response to something that happened was proportional. So it wasn't, you took an eye, I'm taking out your tribe, which is what it used to be. The new law was, in the Hebrew scriptures, was an eye for an eye. A tooth for a tooth. Let's get it on the same level. Adding some order. And then Jesus came along and he said, you've heard it said that it's an eye for an eye, but I tell you, turn the other cheek. See it differently. And I think that overall our goal is to continue our evolution. And when we despair, one of the things that I shared with a few of you before, I share it now again, is that we haven't actually been around since the time of Jesus for that long. It seems like it's a long, long time ago. But I always think of how I think of my grandfather. He was born in 1896. So in my life experience, I have known someone who goes back to 1896. That's about 130 years. How many of those time spans has it been since the time of Jesus? If you do the math, and I did it and did it and did it again because I couldn't believe it, it is 15. It's not long. And when you think of humans and how long we've been on the planet, 200,000 years, these little lifespans are short. And when you start thinking of it that way, then all of a sudden, you realize that we actually are making progress. Sometimes, as now, it may feel like we've just taken 2 steps forward and now we're going backward, but I promise you, it is not 2 steps backward. And yet, to break the patterns, it is helpful to recognize what they are. And I think what we're seeing now is a predictable response to the uncertainty of where things are overall in our life. I am no social scientist. I don't have any kind of PhD in this stuff. But this is what I see. The last time that I think of when the world was this crazy was between World War I and World War II. And how did that happen? When was the world this, like, what just happened? When were we in that space? Right after World War I? Germany had just lost the war. The terms of the surrender of Germany were so intense. They had so much retribution put into them and built into it that the people of Germany were humiliated. That led also to an economic uncertainty and recession, crazy inflation where the amount of currency one day would be halved by the following day. And then we had the Great Depression happening in the United States and on this side of the globe. We had also just come through a worldwide pandemic. And so the whole planet was topsy-turvy, just as it feels like it is now. And the people of Germany particularly needed someone and something to blame. They were ripe for it. When we are in pain, do we not find that as well? That something hurts, and the easiest way to displace that hurt is to put it on somebody else. And so what happened is we discover when we read history that there were small factions who ended up with great power. Might there be a parallel right now? We see in the history propaganda that dehumanizes people, the other. Do we see a parallel right now? The naming, the blaming, the public discrediting of people, the shaming. do you see a parallel now? And people made choices then to keep their families safe, even if it wasn't aligned with their values. And then we had this political situation of Germany wanting to expand. Expansion. Let's try and reclaim some of what we've lost and more. At the same time as the United States was saying, it's your business. And so we have this, it's none of our business from the United States and to some extent from England. And then it's like not paying attention to what they're doing and the harm that they're doing as they annex Czechoslovakia and Austria. And along with this uncertainty, we see the growth of a right wing. We see the growth of, when things are uncertain, let's go back to the way it used to be, with rules, with a closing of the expansion that we might have started to see of acceptance. This is the way it has to be, and if it's not this way, you're out. Do you see the parallel here today? You see how now we're seeing people in various parts of the world moving into going back to traditional male-female relationships are the only way. Trans rights, gay rights, rights to abortion. All of these things that we thought we had settled then become up for grabs because it's something to distract us from our discomfort. And we have a tendency then to go back to what we know, even though it's a small, small silo. And I was watching the show, the morning show on one of the streaming services, I can't remember, Apple. And one person says, and I quote, "Once you villainize someone, you have no choice but to go to war with them." And that hit me because it all comes down to the start of every single one of these conflicts starts with this idea of them being the villain, and therefore we have the right to go to war with them. It starts with dehumanization, where we put a label and we say, you are Muslim, therefore you are bad. You are Israeli, therefore you are bad. You are Jewish, you are Christian, you are right-wing Christian, you are liberal Christian, you are... Name any one of these labels. And they're sticky labels, they don't matter. Nobody is born saying, I'm going to be Palestinian or Israeli. They're just here to be human. And so we have lessons that we can learn from the past, where we can see that there are parallels, and sure, they're not all the same, but there are enough of them that are the same that we can go, yeah, check, check, check. And from that, we can then reasonably surmise that when it happened like this last time, this is what it led to. Now we're in a similar situation today. What do we want it to lead to? The parallels aren't all the same. But we have other challenges that take their place, like climate change. That loss of trust in our institutions, including the news, which we believed was just giving us the news, and then we discover that may not be so. But here's the third part. So I spoke about the parallels, and I spoke about us history repeating. The other part is that there are differences. And one of the differences that is so powerful, especially for us in Canada, is that if you look at that picture of the planet, I bet you in 1930, if you were to place a dot on people you know from parts of the planet, or people who were your neighbors who came from parts of the planet, it would probably be a pretty small circle. Where today, if you were to place on that map a pin dot for people you know from different parts of the planet, it would be scattered. Isn't that amazing? And in Canada, it is even more so. And whether or not you like or dislike our Prime Minister, the one thing he said, which I couldn't find the exact quote for when I went looking for it afterwards, but what he said was, in Canada, we walk with each other, beside each other in our pain, because we are neighbors. And if we can't be peaceful here in Canada, how can we expect peace to be anywhere else? And I think that there's so much power in realizing that when we know people, we don't see their labels as much. We see their peopleness. Not that that's a word, but I'm choosing to coin it. And so what I'd like us to consider, each one of us, is I'm talking about like the big picture. And that same picture applies to each one of us right here. That there are some things that we can guard against because we don't want it to be out there in the big world. Let's make sure that it's not in our worlds, in our homes, as Leora sang. So in times of uncertainty, it is helpful to know that we have a tendency, us humans, to return to silo thinking, where we expanded and allowed more in, now we contract. And our boundaries become tighter. So watch for that. Watch for the times when your thinking is either or, rather than both and. There is pain on both sides of every conflict. Both and. Notice also how often we give power to a small faction. In the case of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict right now, we have a faction called Hamas that committed war crimes that led to Israel responding in a way that is killing innocent people. It's not all people who are Palestinian. It's not all people who are Israeli. These are small faction. It was a small faction that started it. But notice how often in our lives we allow a small faction to upset us. It's something we do all the time. 10 people may say everything is great. One person says that was not that great. Which one are we going to remember? We pay attention to the small faction. So try and put that small faction in its place. And sometimes that means, as I spoke about last week, standing up to the bully and saying, I hear that's your point, and I disagree. Both and. I'm not saying you have to change your opinion. I am simply saying there is another way, and turning the other cheek. Notice that either or thinking. Switch to both and. And when you find yourself tempted to deflect, to deny, to discredit, to distort, to denounce, to dehumanize, instead, discern. What is the wise thing to do here? What is the next most loving, most peaceful action that I can take? And choose that. Because it will help our little 15 lifespans or whatever spans of time that I spoke about. It will help that to evolve more. When we move from eye for an eye to choosing a different way. None of us is getting out here alive. And I say that half lightly and half very, very seriously. What are we here for? To love one another. Let there be peace on earth. Pardon? And let it begin with me. So, unity has a statement for peace. I'm going to ask you all just to read this quietly or out loud if you want. But taking a stand for peace. I stand for peace in the presence of conflict. For love in the presence of hatred. For forgiveness in the presence of injury. I stand for peace in my lifetime. Let there be peace on earth. Let it begin with me. And don't despair. We'll get through this. I bless you.